Good afternoon. My name is Anne Robbins. I'm Associate Curator of Post-1800 Paintings here at the National Gallery and the Curator of Courtauld Impressionists, our new exhibition, Courtauld Impressionists from Manet to Cézanne, which opened just at the beginning of last week. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the exhibition this afternoon. As you all know, the Courtauld Gallery has closed for refurbishment just a few weeks ago, which means that thanks to the generosity of our colleagues at the Courtauld Gallery, we have the opportunity to exhibit 26 of their great masterworks here at the National Gallery this autumn. And this is, of course, wonderful for us. It's wonderful to be able to show them here in Trafalgar Square, where Samuel Courtaulds' legacy is so profoundly felt. So who was Courtauld? He was born in 1876 in a family of French descent, hence a French-sounding name, which had settled in England in the 17th century as they were fleeing persecution. They were Protestant Huguenots who settled in this country in the late 17th century and in the early 19th established a textile business in Essex. And this business soon expanded and grew greatly, turning into a major multinational with branches not just in Europe, but as far as America, and they actually encountered success developing and manufacturing a kind of artificial silk called rayon, which was a cheaper substitute for silk. So with the Courtauld family business having expanded so greatly, when Samuel Courtauld took over in the early 1920s, it meant that he was exceptionally wealthy, and he had the means of acquiring art at a very high level. So he was able to amass this collection of exceptional importance. But he didn't just have a passion for the arts, but he was also passionate about sharing it, about the fostering of the arts, and he was incredibly public-spirited. He very much believes that art was essential to the public, and he was deeply concerned about the public access to the paintings he had collected. He wanted people to enjoy and learn from them. So, in fact, as I'm sure you know, in 1932 he gave a number of the paintings he had collected to the newly founded Courtauld Institute, which he had helped fund and financed himself, and then he ended up bequeathing more of his paintings after his death. But before that, in fact, in 1923, and it is where the story of Courtauld and our history here at the National Gallery intersect in a wonderful way. In 1923, Samuel Courtauld established a special fund of £50,000, which was a very large sum of money at the time. It was the equivalent of 100 new suburban houses. And he had set aside that special sum of money specifically for the purchase of modern foreign paintings for the nation. And so why this decision? It was very much because this kind of painting was still viewed with deep suspicion in England and very much neglected by museums officials. So there were only a few examples of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist works to be seen on the walls of museums. So this was a gift of tremendous importance. These paintings now form the nucleus of our own collection, of our modern foreign collection here at the National Gallery. But first and foremost, Courtauld wanted to ensure that everyone had access to these paintings, and everyone could have the kind of privileged experience he had been able to enjoy himself. So, about the structure of the exhibition, it is formed of these two groups of paintings. So the pictures Courtauld had acquired for himself in the 1920s and early 30s, which now form the core of the Courtauld Gallery, and the collection he funded and assembled for the nation. So now the nucleus of modern foreign works at the National Gallery. So the show is in fact doing two things. It's a celebration of Samuel Courtauld's achievements as a collector, but it's also comparing and assessing these two collections he was assembling simultaneously. But maybe, maybe even more than that, the exhibition is in fact a survey of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism through some of the best works that the artists of this movement ever painted. And you will see that the exhibition includes some of the absolute landmarks in the history of painting. And some of the most emblematic works. And in the hang itself, when we were thinking of how best to organize the exhibition, we chose not to separate these two collections. So the pictures Samuel Courtauld bought for himself and those for the nation, but we display them next to each other in 12 sections, which are each devoted to an artist. So as it was, the exhibition unfolds like a history of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism from Daumier. We start with Daumier and we end with Bonnard. So it's actually beyond Manet to Cézanne, as the title does not indicate. And what we want to highlight is what turning point this precise moment was in the history of painting in France. It was a vital phase when this new generation of artists were bringing a new energy to painting and very much overturning new rules and laying new foundations. And we also try and focus on this particular moment in the 1920s, which was an important time in the history of the reception of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism in this country, where, as I said, it had been much misunderstood. So the first artist in the exhibition and the earliest is Honoré Daumier, so the only artist in the exhibition and in Courtault's collection not directly connected with Impressionism or Post-Impressionism. Daumier was born in Marseille, and he had really made a success. He was quite successful in his lifetime, not as a painter, but as a caricaturist and lithographer. He was producing cartoons. He was very prolific, very successful cartoons for the satirical press of the time, for political journals. And I'm sure you're familiar with his caricatures, which target politicians and lawyers, bankers, actors, all lampoon for their ridicule, and they bring a unique insight into that period. So a great reputation as a cartoonist, but all his life Daumier wanted to achieve success as a painter, and as a painter he also depicted contemporary subjects, but he was also very interested in themes from literature. So he based paintings on scenes from Rabelais, on Molière, and Racine, 17th century French theater, but also Cervantes, Don Quixote's Cervantes, like here. This is one such painting by Daumier on a literary theme. This is based on Cervantes' Don Quixote, this comedy of knights and chivalry, where you see Don Quixote who's charging a flock of sheep, actually thinking this is an advancing army. You see the cloud of dust in the distance. You see as well how much his style has remained very much that of a draftsman, with a strong emphasis on line and his attention to contrast of light and shade. And in fact, this painting is one of 4 exceptions in the exhibition of paintings which were actually never acquired by Courtauld, but which was nonetheless of tremendous importance for him. This Don Quixote formed part of the Lane bequest. So a few words about Sir Hugh Lane. He was a pioneer collector, an Irishman, Irish dealer and collector, and very much a pioneer collector of modern French painting in the first decade of the first and second decade of the 20th century. He died tragically in the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, and then the paintings contained in his bequest were first shown in London, here in Trafalgar Square, in very early 1917. And in fact, so it was a temporary display, a temporary exhibition, which Samuel Courtauld happened to see. And that was a moment of great importance in the shaping of his taste, and he himself talked later of the, I quote, considerable visual shock that this exhibition gave him. And indeed, just 6 years later, when he and his wife were just embarking on forming their own private collection of paintings, they set their sights on this Daumier, so just about 6 years after this exhibition in May 1923, which is actually larger than the earlier painting, but has also a more sketchier quality. It may have been intended as a decoration, actually, and in fact, as a sketch, it probably had extra appeal for the Courtauld, as it was maybe a more accurate reflection of Courtaulds' creativity. So this was no doubt acquired by Samuel Courtauld with the earlier Don Quixote from the Lane bequest still fresh in his mind. And this is something that Courtauld would often do, which was to measure what he bought against what was already in museums and vice versa. Now, the second section in the exhibition is centered around Manet. So Manet, in many regards, the precursor of Impressionism, which painted this now incredibly famous paintings on subject matters drawn from modern life, executed with astonishing freedom in handling. So Manet actually never participated in any of the Impressionists' exhibition in the 1870s and 80s, always preferring to show his work at the official Salon, but he nonetheless was crucially influential on the Impressionists and had a really formative influence on them. He was opposed to conventions, all things which greatly appealed to this new generation of artists, and Courtaulds' collections encompassed both early and late works. But there were already great examples of Manet's work, international collection by the early 1920s, and one of them was this, Manet's Music in the Tuileries Garden, the first major painting of modern city life. Manet was always deeply involved in the world of his day. So it's modern in its subject matter. These are Manet's contemporaries, his friends, and his family, musicians, writers, and fellow painters. Listening to music, to a band playing, to a concert being performed en plein air, but in fact the orchestra is nowhere to be found. We are standing where the orchestra would be. So it is, as I said, modern in its subject matter, modern in the way in which Manet elaborated the composition, basing it on portrait photographs of his friends and relatives, and it is also painted in very much a consciously modern way, as a kind of statement. In addition, it doesn't really have a focal point, so its composition itself is particularly daring. It shows Manet's radically new treatment of space as a statement. So this painting again had been bought by Sir Hugh Lane and exhibited. It was exhibited at the National Gallery in 1917 in this show, which proved an eye-opener for Samuel Courtauld, and which marked his decisive encounter with modern foreign painting. In terms of his own, of the Manet Courtauld collected himself, so as I said, both early and late works. So the earliest of these was a version of the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, so the painting which had created an absolute scandal at the Salon des Refusés in 1863, a scandal because of its harsh and flat colors, a kind of extreme schematization of form, and of course the allusion to the Old Master references. But in fact, it's a pastoral scene, but with references, with also references to contemporary life, where you see the naked model looking straight at us, but surrounded by this young man fully dressed in student attire. So a very famous composition, and Courtauld was no doubt attracted by the particular reputation of this painting and its controversial subject. So an early work in Courtauld's collection, she bought in 1928, but also a late work. So this, the bar at the Folies Bergère, the absolute highlight in Courtault's collection, the painting for which he paid most money, more than £22,000 at the time. It was a sizable sum, and Manet's great last masterpiece. It's a painting which very much sums up his achievements as a painter. First, it depicts his own world, so the world in which he felt most at ease, the world of theaters and cafes and cabarets. It's also a very carefully thought through composition. And in addition, it's a brilliant demonstration of Manet's impressionist techniques of his last years. You see how this Manet's great use of white and the soft blonde harmonies he manages to bring out. So what is it? So first, it's a portrait. We know who this young woman was, not just a paid model. She was one of the actual waitresses at the bar at the Folies Bergère. So the Folies Bergère, this theater, which still stands to this day. It's in the Rue Richer in Paris, in the 9th arrondissement. So a portrait of Suzanne, the waitress, but also an astonishing still life, which is, you see how the bottles and tangerines in the glass bowl are depicted with this incredible mastery. And then behind the waitress herself, who stands frontally at the bar, there is this large mirror which reflects the room in which the scene is set. And we know that the Folies Bergère, the space of the Folies Bergère, is like a horseshoe, and you get a sense of that with the first floor balcony reflected in the mirror. So what we see of the room itself is a kind of blurred image observed in the mirror, which also reflects the smoky atmosphere of the room. And a lot has been said about the waitress's expression. You know, she's distant, possibly melancholic. She's lost in her thoughts. She looks remote and disconnected. But in fact, even more has been said about her pose. So as I said, strangely frontal, whereas the reflection in the mirror shows her as observed from the side. So in fact, as if the mirror had been placed at an angle, whereas she is actually seen from the front. So there is a discrepancy between her and her reflection, which is displaced to the right. And what do we see in the reflection to the right? We see a probably older mustachioed man who is holding a cane, probably posed by an artist friend of Manet who was called Gaston Latouche. But the interesting thing about this is that the man stands where we would have been. So in that sense, we are involved in the painting. It is reflecting a space in which we are supposed to be standing. And this in itself raises many questions and makes us part of the story which Manet is trying to tell here. The story going on here is slightly ambiguous. You know, we are not quite sure of the type of exchange the waitress is having with the man in a top hat. And I think this is really the great talent of Manet. It's involving us in the painting. The fact that the image of the waitress and the reflection in the mirror didn't match was remarked by the contemporary critics from very early on, from the moment when this work was shown at the Salon in 1882, because it was Manet's last great submission to the official Salon, the year before his death. And once this critic called Stop actually, you see, did this wonderful little cartoon in which he corrects Manet's painting by adding the man in the foreground. So really the absolute treasure in Courtault's collection and possibly one of the world's most famous paintings today. Now we move on from Manet to his near namesake Monet. So this time a key figure of the Impressionist movement, one of the founding members of the movement. You all know the story of this group of young painters banding together in 1874 and deciding to exhibit their work independently, having been constantly snubbed by the Salon. And they first show their works in 1874 in the studio of the photographer Nadar. And what their paintings have in common is that they're executed incredibly freely, with broken brushwork, with a kind of lack of finish. And in fact, one of Monet's own paintings, Impression Soleil Levant, Impression Sunrise, will attract particular scorn at the first Impressionist exhibition, and it will be called derisively Impressionist. So this heralded the beginning of this very quickly, shortcut to Impressionism. It heralded the beginning of this artistic movement. So this autumn effect at Argenteuil, the 1873, encompasses all these characteristics of early high Impressionist works. It shows Monet's interest in depicting fleeting effects of light, his interest for the changeability of the weather. You see these rapidly passing clouds in the sky. It looks wonderfully fresh and uncalculated. It is a high Impressionist work. This shows Argenteuil. This is the Paris suburb, northwest of Paris, and this is where the Monet family settled in 1871 when they returned from exile in London, and then this detour via the Netherlands in 1871. And we've hung it next to another view of Argenteuil, this time by Manet. So in fact, the Manet and Monet sections of the exhibition are contiguous, and we managed to make this comparison between these two views of Argenteuil, this one by Manet a year later, which shows the moment in his career when Manet is at his most impressionist. It's a painting which shows his very original assimilation of Impressionism. You see, he turns it into something else. It's slightly larger than the typical canvases that the Impressionists were painting. It's done with broader, longer brush strokes, but it shares with the Impressionist paintings the same attention to light and atmosphere. And the two figures depicted here are actually Madame Monet and the Monet's young son, Jean, who was 7 at the time. And they lived, as I said, they lived in Argenteuil, and Manet was just visiting them on that day, on that sunny day of spring 1874. The second Monet in the show is this later view of Antibes this time. And it was the later of the 4 paintings by Monet Courtauld owned. So in fact, his taste does not seem to have stretched as far as Monet's late works. You know, this increasingly abstracted views of his garden at Giverny. This records a trip Monet did to Antibes on the French Riviera in 1888. Where, of course, he was terribly impressed by the specific quality of light by the Mediterranean. He was a man from the north. He had painted around Paris, in Normandy, or in England, or in the Netherlands, but nothing had quite prepared him for the shock of the bright Mediterranean sunlight, and he paints this wonderful series of paintings showing the Mediterranean, and then beyond these are the mountains of the Esterel. And here just a detail to show just Monet's sheer virtuosity and his absolute mastery of effect. You see how in 1 or 2 blobs of paint he manages to evoke boats with their sails flapping in the wind is absolutely extraordinary. So do look at it closely in the exhibition. Then Degas, like Monet, an essential figure of the Impressionist movement, a transformed painting with you're all familiar with his scenes from modern life, the entertainers, ballerinas, scenes from race courses and women at their toilettes. What set Degas apart in terms of his reputation in England in the early 20th century is that his work had been praised by the British public, in fact, from quite early on. there was a predilection for his work here in this country, which other artists like Cézanne were not able to enjoy, because Degas was very much a painter of figures, and his art relied heavily on drawing, and it is something which was very much praised by the British public. So probably this, the fact that there was a predilection for his work in this country, and also the fact that he was the very first French living master to have triggered Courtault's interest, means that one of the first purchases made from the Courtauld Fund was this early work by Degas, the young Spartan, so seen on a rather obscure subject matter. This is taken from Plutarch, the Greek, first century AD Greek biographer, which shows how Lycurgus, the Spartan legislator, ordered girls to engage in contests of wrestling. So very obscure, the kind of subject which would have been exhibited on the walls of the official Salon, but very much a proto-impressionist picture. So atypical, not characteristic of Degas' art, and in fact Courtauld himself was very uncertain about this potential purchase when he and his friends were considering it as a potential acquisition, and I quote him, he says, "I cannot quite make up my mind about it. It is stimulating, and I appreciate its historical importance, but he is not quite sure as to what decision to make." In the end, it was bought because it was also quite cheap, since as an uncharacteristic work. Maybe at this point I should say a bit more about the Courtauld Fund itself, why it was created by Courtauld. So it was very much because Britain was lagging behind when it came to acquiring examples of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art for the country, and it was felt that something had to be done, and that there was an urgency to make up for lost time. And the other reason why Courtauld went ahead with this idea of setting aside this large sum of money specifically for that purpose is that, in fact, new galleries were being built at the back of what is now Tate Britain at Millbank, so on the site of an old prison at Millbank, which was a Millbank penitentiary. And these new galleries had been paid for by a dealer, Sir Joseph Devine, who was also a great benefactor to the nation, and the construction had started, and it was not quite sure what was going to fill them, what was going to feature in these galleries. There were there were groups of paintings, but so the Lane bequest, and then purchases from the Degas sales, which had been made in 1919, but not a modern foreign collection as such. So this is one of the reasons why Courtauld made this decision of establishing the Courtauld Fund, is that a collection had to be shaped quite quickly, and if possible, a collection of great quality. And we wanted to illustrate Devine in this exhibition, and the role he played also as a great benefactor a few years before Courtauld, and we do so by showing this small work by Degas, showing his friend Carlo Pellegrini. This small painting was actually paid for by Devine and presented to the nation in 1916. So I think we can go as far as saying that Devine's gift paved the way for Courtauld's gesture of benefaction to the nation a few years later. And then another Degas in the show, The Woman at the Window, which shows the artist's experimental technique. You see how the artist Degas has drained the paint of its oil and thinned it with turpentine to achieve this wonderful translucent effect. And then this gorgeous work, striking for its extremely unconventional point of view, we see much of the scenery on the stage and even the rails on which these decors were being brought on the stage, and at the same time the wonderful effect of artificial light, which brings out the the vivid pink and yellow flowers on the skirts of the ballerina and the particular luminous transparency of the tutus. And it's also a painting which, so Courtauld bought it in June 1927, and the painting had an excellent provenance. It had been acquired by British collectors from very early on, from as early as 1874 in Britain. Now Pissarro, so Pissarro very much the arch impressionist, the only artist of the group who exhibited in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibition, and who also constantly strove to maintain the group's cohesion, the cohesion of the original group, while always looking for new talents and inviting younger artists to join. And he went as far as championing the work of Gauguin and then of Seurat, and even adopted Seurat's style for a brief moment in his career. So in our section devoted to Pissarro, we managed to pair 2 paintings, both cityscapes by Pissarro, so one from Courtauld's private collections, this view of the quays at Rouen, dating from a moment in early 1883 when Pissarro was staying at Rouen, staying in a hotel which was on this square and overlooking the Place Lafayette, but you see that he's fascinated by the industrial activity on the banks of the River Seine rather than by the wonderful medieval monuments of central Rouen. And then the painting from the Courtauld Fund that is now at the National Gallery is this Boulevard Montmartre, another great cityscape, really remarkable for its daring technique. Again, here Pissarro is staying in a different hotel, this time in central Paris. It's at the corner of the Rue de Rouault and the Boulevard des Italiens, and he's looking down on the wet pavements on the boulevard. It's unique in Pissarro's oeuvre as being his only night scene, and he's absolutely excelled at rendering the effect of light on the wet streets. And you see how his fragmented brushstrokes evokes a shiny wet pavement, and then the wonderful halos around the gaslights arranged in a line in the middle of the composition. So Pissarro was not just a great painter and a founding member of the Impressionists, but also a great champion of these new younger artists such as Seurat, whom he invited to exhibit with the Impressionists, which also precipitated the dispersion of the original group. But Seurat was a very young man, who extremely promising young artist who developed a new way of painting, who developed a new art based on actually a scientifically grounded method, which based on the juxtaposition of dots of pure color, which instead of being mixed on the canvas itself, were juxtaposed and then blended optically by the eye to create a different color. And I'll show you examples. That's probably going to be a little clearer. And also, he had based his idea on his new technique on the idea that complementary color enhance each other. But this, of course, required great control in his handling of the space. And like the Impressionists, Seurat depicted subjects of modern, urban and suburban life, but in a far more structured and monumental way. Here, in his early masterpiece, Bases at Asnières, he's depicting a mundane subject, but on an incredibly grand scale, normally reserved for history painting or mythological painting. These are young workmen who are relaxing during probably their lunchtime breaks. They're taking their leisure by the river, and this is actually the painting he started before he had fully evolved his pointillist, his divisionist technique. He had been an accomplished draftsman, and I think this is very much evident here. He creates pictures with an extraordinary sense of volume, with a real sculptural prominence. And we know a lot about the circumstances of this, the purchase of this painting for the nation by Courtauld and his fellow trustees. I should say that Courtauld had not just given the money for the Courtauld Fund, but he was also actively engaged in administering it. So he had set it up as a trust, which was administered by 5 trustees, so himself really taking the leading role, then the directors of the Tate and of the National Gallery, and then two friends of his, Michael Sadler and Henry Benting, who were also champions of this new painting in Britain in the 1920s and themselves great collectors. So the way it worked is that the Courtauld Fund trustees would look at paintings on the market and decide whether there were good potential purchases, or dealers would come to them and suggest acquisitions. Here in this case, it's Percy Moore Turner, who was one of Courtauld's advisors, alerted Courtaud's attention to this painting being available on the market in Paris. It was with Félix Fénéon, who had been a friend of Seurat's and also a very great art critic. But a decision had to be made very quickly, and usually Courtauld and his trustees would go themselves, would cross the channel and go and check paintings in Paris. This time that could not be organized, and Percy Moore Turner wanted an immediate answer, and Courtauld decided to go ahead with the purchase. So he took this risk, because he was of course engaging a lot of money, which was his, but for the nation's benefit. And in his letter to the director of the Tate, he and I quote him, he says that I quote him, "I am prepared to accept full responsibility, but please support me if you think I did the right thing." So there is a very certain amount of nervousness in the way in which he is very aware of having taken a risk, and of course he did the right thing. This is one of the great masterpieces of post-impressionism. Now, for himself, Seurat bought also a large number of paintings by Seurat. This Bridget Cobra, which is probably a close-up, a more accurate example of what the divisionist technique really is. You see this idea that color has a greater effect if juxtaposed in dots rather than being mixed on the canvas, and of course it's a marvelous little thing. It's carefully constructed, perfectly proportioned, and you see how there's a sense of rhythms in the mass, and these tiny, almost proto Bauhaus figures on the riverbank. Another great Seurat in Courtaud's collection. This time a portrait of his mistress Madeline Knobloch, who had also given him a son who died in infancy, in fact of the same disease as the one from which Seurat himself died. This is a very strange work with elements of caricature in it. It says, you see the kind of comical contrast between Madeleine's statuesque and voluptuous body and the very dainty and unstable table and the mirror perched on top of it in the foreground, and these very strange waves on the wallpaper in the background, and then the interesting addition of the mirror. Of what was originally a mirror. You see, this painting has been carefully studied at the Courtauld Gallery in recent years, studied in conservation, and it was found that this still life of flowers in the upper left of the painting initially showed a self-portrait by Seurat, and as such the only self-portrait of the artist in his whole career, and then he had later painted it over, probably for the sake of propriety. This is how the Courtaulds lived with their painting. You see the interior at Hume House. So Hume House was it still stands. It's on 20 Portman Square in the heart of Mayfair, one of London's great Georgian interiors. built in the 18th century, a very, very fine house which the Courtauld moved into in the spring of 1926. And here again, it may have been one of the reasons why they assembled this great collection at a rather rapid pace is that they had space on their walls and wanted it to look as good as possible. They also entertained a lot, and they wanted art of the highest level on their walls. So this is the front parlor in the ground floor, where you see Cézanne, Renoir, and the Seurat, a young woman powdering herself. That's Hume House in the early 1930s, and then what it's like now, and it's now a private club, so it's very hard to get access. And then one last Seurat from Courtauld's private collection, the channel at Gravelines. Gravelines is very close, is in France, but very close to the Belgian border. It's north of Calais. It's between Calais and the Belgian border, and it is where Seurat spent the last summer of his life. Seurat died very young, only aged 31, and it's a painting which is remarkable for its very spareness. There's really nothing much to catch the eye apart from sand, sky, and water, and yet it has this incredible dazzling quality, this impression of vastness and vibration of light. Renoir. So Renoir was central to the Courtaud's collection. I should say that Courtauld collected with his wife, who died prematurely in 1931, but Elizabeth Courtauld was also quite involved in the formation of their private collection, and they absolutely loved the art of Renoir. Probably among all founding members of the Impressionist group, maybe the most committed to depicting the human figures. I'm sure you have in mind many sensual nudes by Renoir, and also scenes of conviviality. Also very nice, very perceptive portrait, and he was also brilliant. He had a brilliantly fluid technique, very fluid brushwork, and a bright palette. And then you know how his art took a different direction from the 1880s. When he was at the moment when he was seeking greater monumentality, and turned to the classical tradition of French painting in the last decades of his life. This early-ish landscape by Renoir was in fact the earliest Renoir in Courtaud's collection. This is another high Impressionist work, almost the quintessential Impressionist painting. This shows the river Seine, this time at Chatou, so further south from Asnières. This is the west of Paris, and it was a place which was popular with city dwellers. It was also a very fashionable boating site, so people would come from Paris on day trips to enjoy this kind of sporting leisure by the river. It's completely delightful. It's particularly luminous, and you really get a sense of shimmering sunlight with this reflection on the water. And that was bought by the Courtauds actually late. I think this was the later of the latest Renoir acquisition in 1929, and it was actually they acquired it by exchanging a painting they already owned, which was this Matisse Ballerina. So it's interesting to see how their taste evolved. When they first started to collect, the Courtauds turned their attention to very much contemporary paintings. A recent Renoir, a recent Hippolyte Marchand, who's now long forgotten, but who painted kind of cubist landscapes, and then this very contemporary 1927 Matisse Ballerina, which they sent back in 1929, so a year later, to acquire Renoir's skiff. Now Renoir's at the theater, one of our own painting, bought from the Courtauld Fund in August 1923, one of the two earliest purchases made from the Courtauld Fund, which again shows Renoir's great skill and ease, and also his excitement in depicting modern life. I think he really excels at rendering the slight apprehension of this very young woman. We know from the French title that it is her first formal outing, la première sortie, and you really get a sense of her shyness and being unsure about where she is. She's of course closely chaperoned, but we're very aware that this is a moment when she's entering grown-up society. The other Renoir, which was bought from the Courtauld Fund, was this young woman bathing, which is not in the exhibition. It is not that we've sent it on loan anywhere, or it's the reason why we were not able to include it in the show is that it is not part of the national collection anymore. And here I should say more about how the Courtauld Fund worked. With the Courtauld Fund came a list of artists to be acquired from the fund, and there was also the special provision, the special clause that any painting acquired could be returned or swapped if a better example of an impressionist or impressionist work appeared on the market. And this possibility was used on several occasions. This was bought in December 1925 and sold by the Tate 19 years later in 1944, and with proceeds from the sale, an early Matisse and also a Cubist Picasso were acquired, which caused a great outcry because although even though Picasso featured on the list which accompanied the Courtauld Fund, Courtauld had no taste for Cubism, and it is not the kind of work that he would have himself selected. But anyway, an interesting story around this picture. Then the Renoir, one of the highlights in the Courtauld's Renoir collection is, of course, La Loge, so our poster image, or the theater box, again, which shows Renoir fascinated by the social ritual of a theater. This is a very elegant young couple sitting in quite squeezed in a theater box, and we're very close. We're looking at them from very close, as if we were ourselves looking through opera glasses. We know who these people were. This is Nini Lopez, nicknamed Fish Face, who was a professional model in Paris. So she clearly here enjoys looking and being looked at. She's almost a kind of a fashion figure. And then the man just behind her was posed by Edmond, who was Renoir's brother, Edmond Renoir. So it is an utterly enchanting work. You see the variation of pink and flesh tones, and very much you get the sense of the pleasure that Renoir took in depicting flesh and skin and textures, creating this refined effects of silk and the fine leather of the glove. So he really is. It is an evocation of life and of the joy of living, and a painting which cost him a great deal of money. His second most expensive painting after the Bar at the Folies Bergère, and to give you a sense of to put things in proportion. See, if you add the price Courtauld paid for this La Loge and what he paid for the Bar, that gives you the whole of the Courtauld Fund money. So he was really collecting for himself on a different scale altogether, and this is how that's how he displayed the work in the music room at Hume House in one of the Salon. And then I'm going to show you a picture of La Loge now in another domestic interior, this time in the 21st century across the Atlantic. So this is Tram Tower, and amazingly, apparently our colleague at the Courtauld Gallery have been told that theirs is a copy. Then another Renoir in Courtauld's collection, the portrait of Vollard, the talented businessman, and one of Renoir's principal dealers after 1900. He was a great connoisseur. He is a painting commissioned from Renoir by Vollard himself, and then, given by Renoir to Vollard, and then bought from Courtauld, by Courtauld from Vollard. So a very, very clear provenance. And in fact, we know that Vollard himself had misunderstood. Vollard had believed that this painting would actually join the National Gallery collection and not the private collection. And of course, he is here shown very much in the pose of the connoisseur. You see, assessing this little, holding this little statuette, which we know was by his contemporary, the sculptor Mayol. And then this is a painting. This is a very late Renoir painting in 1918, so immediately before, a year before Renoir's death. But this is a painting with which the Courtauld started their collection of modern French painting. When that was just in 1922, the earliest purchase with Hippolyte Marchand of Saint-Paul. And it is, I think it's typical of Renoir's last creative period, which has been much misunderstood and for a time overlooked, because it's hard to reconcile this late painting which Renoir did in the first 2 decades of the 20th century with his more experimental attempts at more daring painting of the 1870s. And Degas, in fact, I quote Degas, used to describe these late paintings, and I think the description is fitting for this work, as, I quote, a cat playing with balls of yarn. And I think it's very much the impression you get here if you look at Renoir's very free technique. We have 2 Toulouse-Lautrecs in the exhibition. So Toulouse-Lautrec's unusual character, widely eccentric. I'm sure you know, you have images of Toulouse-Lautrec. He had been crippled by 2 accidents in his youth. He was born at Albi, but became famous for depicting the bohemian life of Montmartre in posters and paintings with wonderful bold lines and audacious colors. So Toulouse-Lautrec was a painting acquired from the Courtauld Fund in May 1926, and 3 years later the Courtauld bought this quite striking work, this portrait of Jeanne Avril, Jeanne Avril was a star performer at the Moulin Rouge. She was a fantastic dancer who performed. Who had great individuality. She was nicknamed the Delirious Orchid. And yet here she's, you wouldn't assume that, it's a very, she looks quite withdrawn. She looks older than, she was still in her 20s when this was painted, and you'd never guess that in this work. And yet you get a sense of the biting humor of Toulouse-Lautrec, and it's fantastic mastery of pastel. In terms of the techniques, this is actually oil paint with pastel. Now Cézanne, so Cézanne, again, you'll see in the exhibition that Cézanne occupies half a room, so it's like a mini exhibition inside the exhibition, and it reflects the importance which Cézanne held in Courtauld's collection. He was described by contemporary critics as the hero of Courtauld's collection. Cézanne is the artist on which the Courtauld spent most money. Between 1923 and 1937, they acquired 11 paintings, 5 works on papers, and also letters, late letters by the artist. So Cézanne had associated with the Impressionists. He had exhibited with them twice, but he soon grew dissatisfied with the Impressionist art, with a kind of intuitive response to light and color, and all his life thought, there is this famous quote about Cézanne saying that he wished to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art in museums. But it's absolutely true. He always wanted to give solidity to his paintings, and was always in search of what he called an artistic truth. So Cézanne was misunderstood by his contemporaries, and later lauded by generations of early 20th century artists as the precursor of a new art. But in any way, the Courtauld's collection very much asserts the preeminence of Cézanne's art, with still lifes, great landscapes, great figure paintings. So this extraordinary still life, which was the first Cézanne purchased in 1923. Courtauld later describes the moment when he was converted to the art of Cézanne. It was a kind of religious experience which happened in 1922 when he went to see an exhibition in London at the Burlington Fine Arts Club, and there he had the revelation of Cézanne by looking at the landscape by the French master on the walls, and that triggered his interest in Cézanne's painting and prompted the start of his collection of works by Cézanne. So this is an incredibly complex and very artificial composition which ignores the laws of traditional perspective. You see, it's a painting of a plaster cast which Cézanne had in his studio. It's very hard to figure out what's happening in the painting at first. You quickly realize that in fact you're looking at a painting depicting paintings. These are actual canvases which are wedged between the table and the wall. And you see the very interesting way in which the blue fabric of the painted still life to the left merges with the real fabric of the still life in the foreground, but of course it's all painted. So Cézanne very much enjoyed this kind of visual games. Then this another great still life where the sense of space in it is almost sculptural. Then we have four landscapes. This early farm in Normandy of 1882, again incomparably fresh with a kind of symphony of greens. This remarkable landscape showing the tall trees at the Jas de Bouffon. The Jas de Bouffon was a Provençal manor house on the outskirts of Aix-en-Provence, which had been bought by Cézanne's father, and where Cézanne regularly retreated. He very much enjoyed the solitude that the Jas de Bouffon had to offer. And here you see his astonishing technique, the small parallel brushstrokes, the way in which he has ordered the composition with this very methodical brushstrokes and this shimmering effect of the way in which he evokes the summer leaves of the trees gently ruffled by the wind. Then one of Cézanne's great masterpieces, the Lac d'Annecy, very atypical for Cézanne's production. This is not northern France, this is not around Paris, and not his native Provence, but it was painted during a specific trip which Cézanne did in July 1896 on the encouragement of his wife and son. They went to the French Alps, to Haute-Savoie, by the Lac d'Annecy, and it was the kind of landscape that Cézanne encountered there. He found very disconcerting at first. He was not used to tall mountains, but rather to the hills of Provence, and there was something also very new for him in the minerality of the pure mountain air, which he at first struggled to capture, and then this resulted in this absolute masterpiece where you see how Cézanne has managed to bring up the underlying structure and the harmony of the landscape in this harmony of blues and greens. And this is a contemporary postcard showing this very site. So you are looking at the Château de Duin on the opposite bank of the lake. Then the two paintings bought from the Courtauld Fund were a still life by the artist and the landscape. And I think I should stress that unlike Degas or Gauguin in the 1920s, Cézanne's paintings were still regarded as particularly controversial. None was bought at the sale of Degas' paintings in 1918. The Tate trustees refused to show his work even as long-term loans on the walls of the museum, and Cézanne very much concentrated the debate about modernism, which was taking place in Britain in the early 1920s. So Courtauld was also very much on a crusade to get Cézanne's art accepted and validated by the museum authorities. And he managed to do so by acquiring from the Courtauld Fund this self-portrait of the early 1880s. And of course, choosing a self-portrait was quite significant. It's a great way of imposing an artist in a collection with his own image, self-image. It's also a brilliant, it's a small but absolutely brilliant work. A very good example of Cézanne's so-called constructive strokes, which with unified and diagonal strokes of color. So acquired in December 1925, and the first painting by Cézanne to enter the national collection. So very significant. And then that was this Cézanne was bought, this Cézanne landscape was bought in January 1926. And in fact, by then, even by January 1926, the Courtauld Fund was nearly exhausted, and Courtauld had to give extra money from his own pocket to enable this purchase. It's hard to believe, but even then in 1926, the Tate and National Gallery directors were still very reluctant towards the art of Cézanne, and it is something that Courtauld had to personally impose Cézanne and these two purchases. Now for himself, he bought the Man with a Pipe in October 1927 and the Card Players, so of course one of these 5 compositions by Cézanne painted in the 1890s showing men playing cards, and one of Cézanne's most iconic and powerful works, and a painting which Courtauld very much wanted to acquire, except it had a very, very high price tag. And at some point, the price was so high that he even considered selling the Lac d'Annecy that we were just looking at to be able to make this purchase. And in the end, he didn't have to resort to that and was able to add this to his collection. So it was his second most expensive Cézanne after the Sainte-Victoire, which unfortunately could not come to this exhibition. And that's how he lived with the Cézanne. You see in the dining room, in the back parlor, which he used as his dining room. This is, I must go faster, but this is the first catalogue of Courtauld's collection, which he Courtauld privately funded, and it was privately printed in 1934, and the first record of this extraordinary collection that he and his wife had assembled in the 1920s, early 30s. And this is the copy we have in the exhibition was given by Courtauld himself to the National Gallery in 1934. And with Van Gogh is also key to this story. Van Gogh, of course, had a very brief and nonetheless prolific career. He was active as an artist for less than 10 years. You're all very familiar with his work, which evolved from early Dutch works, you know, painted in kind of earthy tones, to very intense and high, with intense works with high-keyed colors and very expressive brushwork of the late 1880s. And this is the first, that was the first Van Gogh to have been bought from the Courtauld Fund in 1923, in October 1923, and as such the first Van Gogh to enter the national collection in this country, painted in May 1889. This is just outside the asylum which Van Gogh had entered voluntarily. In May 1889, he had suffered repeat mental breakdowns and was seeking help. Of course, it's one of his most energetic and moving canvases. It's a moment in his career where he is absolutely at the zenith of his in the development of his art, and you see here how he has constructed forms out of this kind of hallucinatory spirals and volutes in the sky. It's as if the strong wind of the south, you know, the Mistral, is putting everything into movement with these intense colors. And then this Postman Roulin of 1889 was actually bought from the Courtauld Fund in December 23. There was in December 1923, it was a sort of landmark event in the story of Van Gogh's reception in this country. There was the first monographic show of Van Gogh's work organized at the Leicester Galleries, so very close to here. And the Courtauld Fund trustees, of course, were very interested in the exhibition as they saw in it the possibility of acquiring works for the collection. And they had been warned that Van Gogh's Sunflowers would not be available because the painting was still with the family, and Van Gogh's sister-in-law was completely opposed to the idea of selling it. She was too emotionally attached to the painting to even consider parting with it. So the Courtauld Fund trustees bought two works, the chair, Van Gogh's chair, which now hangs upstairs, and Postman Roulin, that was the second purchase. But very soon after, in fact in the next week or two after having settled the purchase, Courtauld started to have second thoughts about it and asked again whether Madame Van Gogh would finally agree to sell the painting, to sell the sunflowers. And in the end, she agreed, very reluctantly, but she did. And I quote her, she said, "I felt as if I could not bear to separate from the picture, but it is a sacrifice for the sake of Vincent's glory." So this is the story of the acquisition of our very own sunflowers, which of course have become a destination work at the National Gallery, and for that reason could not be included in the exhibition because we very much wanted to for them to remain freely accessible by the public. Then I'm nearly done. Now Gauguin, Gauguin of course had a tumultuous life. He was a sailor, a stockbroker, and painted this very from very early on experimental works with bold and inventive compositions, whether he was working in Brittany in the 1880s or later in the Caribbean or in Tahiti, where he in the end he died. And the Gauguin, which are Gauguin was very important and best loved artist by the much loved by the Courtauld. This is actually this work from 1889 painted in Brittany during Gauguin's third extended stay in Brittany was the first acquisition of a work by a post-impressionist artist by Samuel Courtauld in early 1923. And he made this purchase at the same time as this base is at Tahiti, which so bought at the same time as the Breton landscape, but then sold again by Courtauld when he later, was able to acquire what I'm sure he would have would have been considered as greater examples of Gauguin's Tahitian work. So the Terreriora, or the Dream, dates from Gauguin's second Tahitian stay, and you see here two women watching over a sleeping child, and it was to add to the interest of the painting. At the time, it was believed that this canvas had a biographical element because it was thought to represent Gauguin's own hut, his own dwellings in Tahiti. But in fact, what we know now is that all these carved low reliefs were entirely imagined by the artist. So this is it's a fascinating work. It's enigmatic. It's captivating, and the dream. Its title Terreriora, which means the dream, I think reinforces this particular aspect of the work. Then another highly evocative painting is Gauguin's Nevermore, with its title borrowed from Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, which has this kind of as a leitmotif, you see Nevermore in the poem itself, and Gauguin very much intended this painting as mysterious and gave very little clues for us to understand what is really going on here. He said that the bird, I quote, the bird of the devil is keeping watch. Of course, it harks back to the great tradition of the reclining nude, but it brings, with Gauguin's very own touch, with its distinctive boldness, and it's strongly decorative, of course, with its incredible and jewel-like colors. And the final artist in the exhibition is, the final section is devoted to Bonnard, who was not quite Courtault's contemporary, but not far. So a very complex artist who had been quite radical in his youth. In his 1890s, he was one of the founding members of the Nabi group, and then later, in the first decade of the 20th century, had adopted a kind of late Impressionist style at a time when Impressionism was starting to become outmoded. But he actually turned it into something else, and the two, the painting which the Courtauld acquired for the private collection I think is quite typical of Bonnard's more Impressionist technique. This shows Vernonnet, so the house where the Bonnards lived at that time, which was just a few kilometers from Giverny, where Monet lived at the time. And the painting which the Courtauld bought for the nation was this later work, The Table, so a very striking painting, again showing Marthe, the artist's wife, who's looking slightly elusive. She's actually feeding a little dog. You can just see the dog to the left of the painting, expecting his food. It's truly radiant, with this striking white, the white area of the tablecloth on which these remnants of a meal are arranged, and you see how Bonnard has varied the viewpoint. For instance, there's this basket with fish and a lemon in it. In the foreground is observed from above, whereas the fruit bowl just in front of Marthe is observed from the side. This is a kind of liberties that Bonnard was taking, and something that Courtauld, who was a great admirer of Cézanne, would have found very appealing. So a real masterpiece by Bonnard, and the most contemporary purchase done from the Courtauld Fund in December 1925. So it's a painting which was bought just a few months after its completion. So it would have been regarded at the time as incredibly contemporary. Now, this and the other purchases from the fund were first exhibited in June 1926 in the newly opened modern foreign galleries at the Tate, so open in great pomp here, and great pomp and ceremonies. This is King George V at the opening ceremony itself. So Devine is the man standing right to the left of the painting, looking straight at us, and Courtauld is also there, as you would expect. He's to the right of the painting, sitting to the right of the lady in red in the foreground, and turning his back at us in his usual very modest manner. And these are the new. So this is what these new galleries looked like when they first opened in June 1926, and they really provided the public with unprecedented exposure to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. So what we hope is that this exhibition is a fitting tribute to Courtauld here at the National Gallery, now that the Courtauld Gallery has closed its door, as something we very much wanted to highlight is the particular resonance of Courtauld's name here at the National Gallery. And we hope that the exhibition gives you a chance to remind yourself of this very great contribution he made, not just to the National Collection, but also in the larger sense to the widening of the appreciation of the so-called new painting in this country. So thank you very much.